They fed slaves to wild beasts while the crowd cheered. But the next emperor invented punishments even darker. The Colosseum shook with noise, tens of thousands of Romans screaming, not for sport or honor, but for death. Slaves were pushed into the arena, trembling as gates burst open and lions charged. The crowd rose, hungry for the screams, their cheers drowning out the sound of flesh being torn apart. For Rome, this wasn't cruelty. This was entertainment. Fathers brought their children, mothers clapped, emperors smiled. To them, the enslaved and the conquered were less than human, fodder for a spectacle that defined Roman pride. But soon even this horror wasn't enough. As emperors rose and fell, each sought to outdo the last, to shock the people with punishments darker than anything seen before. Iron cages heated until victims burned alive. Men thrown against beasts with no weapons, forced to die slowly before a roaring crowd. Humiliation so grotesque that death itself seemed merciful. Rome called itself the center of civilization. Yet inside its arenas it revealed its true face. Power built on the bodies of the powerless, cruelty disguised as glory. The Colosseum became not just a place of blood, but a tool of control, a reminder to every slave, foreigner, and outcast of their place in the empire. The empire's soul was never marble and gold. It was sand soaked with blood, bones broken for amusement, and lives erased for applause. This is the story of ancient Rome's most brutal and inhumane arena spectacles, when cruelty went too far. The Colosseum rose like a mountain of stone and iron above the city of Rome, its arches towering, its corridors filled with the roar of tens of thousands of voices. To the citizens of the empire, this monument was proof of Roman greatness. To those who entered its gates as slaves, captives, or condemned criminals, it was the doorway to a nightmare from which there was no return. Slaves were the lifeblood of the Roman spectacle. Taken from conquered lands, Gaul, Greece, Africa, Judea, they were marched in chains, branded with hot irons, and sold like livestock. A farmer's son from Germania could be torn from his family, shackled and thrown into the pit alongside seasoned gladiators. A young woman from Thrace might be forced into humiliating performances before being led to slaughter. The Romans called this justice. They said it was order, punishment for rebels and criminals. But the truth was simpler. It was entertainment. To the people, the deaths of slaves were no more tragic than the snapping of a twig beneath their sandals. The games began in the morning, and the air reeked of sweat, blood, and burning incense. Trumpets blared. The first to enter the arena were often the weakest, the enslaved who had no training, no weapons, and no hope. They were released into the sand, terrified, as gates swung open and beasts emerged. Lions starved for days were unleashed upon men and women who had only moments to run before claws sank into flesh. The crowd cheered louder at each scream, each desperate struggle. Children watched wide-eyed, learning early that Roman power was measured in blood. Senators lounged in shaded seats, nodding with approval. And above them all the emperor sat, deciding who lived and who died with a flick of his hand. But the arena was more than entertainment. It was a tool of fear. For every slave who watched from the stands, seeing others of their kind torn apart, the message was clear. Obedience was survival. Resistance meant death. The empire used cruelty as a language, and the Colosseum was the loudest voice of all. There were no limits to the imagination of Rome's rulers. When lions and leopards no longer thrilled the masses, emperors devised new horrors. Prisoners were forced to reenact mythological punishments. A man burned alive to mimic Prometheus. A woman devoured by a bull to echo Pasiphae. These were not plays. They were executions disguised as stories. For the Roman elite, cruelty was proof of power. To show mercy was weakness. To shock the people was strength. And so the punishments grew darker, each emperor desperate to outdo the last. Some condemned slaves to fight wild beasts with nothing but bare hands. Others were nailed to crosses within the arena, their suffering dragged out for hours as the crowd jeered. And yet, even in this world of cruelty, whispers spread of those who resisted, of slaves who refused to scream, of prisoners who spat at their executioners. Their defiance was small, fleeting, but it carried weight. Because even in the shadow of Rome's greatest monument to blood, humanity struggled to survive. This was Rome at its height, marble temples above, rivers of blood below. Civilization for some, horror for others. And the Colosseum, its sands soaked with countless lives, stood as the perfect symbol of what Rome truly was. The Colosseum was never satisfied with mere blood. Each spectacle had to surpass the last, each emperor desperate to leave his mark on Rome's memory. What began as executions soon became elaborate performances of cruelty, designed not only to kill, but to humiliate, to strip away the last fragments of dignity from those condemned. By mid-morning, after the weakest had been torn apart by beasts, the crowd demanded more. Trumpets blared again, and a new set of victims was led into the arena. These were not trained gladiators with armor and swords. They were slaves, rebels, and criminals condemned to fight for survival. Some were given wooden weapons that snapped on the first strike, others were left entirely defenseless. Against them, Rome unleashed not only lions and tigers, but bears, crocodiles, and even armored warriors. The spectacle was carefully staged. To the Romans, this was theater, each death a performance crafted for maximum impact. The sand became a stage upon which human suffering was choreographed. If a man fought bravely, he was kept alive long enough to draw out the drama before his inevitable slaughter. If a woman begged for mercy, the crowd laughed, enjoying the degradation more than the kill. Emperors competed to design the most shocking punishments. One ordered prisoners sewn into animal skins and thrown to starving dogs, their screams echoing as the beasts tore them apart. Another had cages of fire lowered slowly onto the condemned, forcing the audience to watch as flesh blistered and bone cracked. Some victims were bound together and forced into combat, chained at the wrist, so that every strike harmed them both. But it was not only men who suffered. Women, too, were paraded into the arena, often stripped and mocked before their execution. Some were thrown to wild animals. Others were forced to fight against gladiators in spectacles designed to humiliate as much as to kill. Children, too, were not spared, sometimes executed alongside their parents as the ultimate display of Rome's power over the powerless. The crowd never questioned the morality of these shows. To them, it was proof of Rome's greatness, the empire's divine right to rule. Each scream reminded them of their superiority. Each death reinforced the idea that Rome's power was absolute. Yet beneath the roar of the crowd, something darker was taking root. The cruelty of the games was not only destroying the slaves, it was corrupting Rome itself. Senators who once debated philosophy now placed bets on how long a man could last against a bear. Children who might have grown into statesmen learned instead to laugh at agony. The arena turned cruelty into culture, and Rome into a civilization drunk on blood. And as the years passed, the scale of the spectacles only grew. Hundreds of animals slaughtered in a single day, thousands of captives executed during festivals, entire battles reenacted with real deaths, turning history itself into a stage for Rome's thirst. The Colosseum was no longer just an arena. It was Rome's mirror, and what it reflected was an empire that had traded humanity for spectacle, compassion for control, and dignity for the roar of the crowd. The rising action had begun, and soon Rome's cruelty would reach its darkest point. The day of the emperors, a grand festival arrived, and with it came a promise whispered through the streets of Rome that this spectacle would eclipse all others before it. Citizens poured into the Colosseum in numbers so great that even the upper tiers overflowed. Vendors sold wine and bread, children ran through the aisles, and senators reclined in shaded seats. They came not only for blood, but for the emperor's newest invention. The opening acts had already shaken the arena. Scores of prisoners torn apart by lions, others forced into hopeless combat. But the crowd's appetite was insatiable, and the emperor knew it. With a signal, the next horror began. Iron cages were wheeled into the arena, their bars glowing red from fire. Inside them, slaves screamed as the heat scorched their flesh. The cages were lowered slowly, cruelly, until the victims' bodies convulsed in unbearable agony. The audience did not look away. They leaned forward, fascinated, as though watching a play. Then came the reenactments, Rome's most grotesque form of theater. A man was dressed as Icarus, only to be hurled from a platform high above the sand. His body shattered on the ground, blood pooling around his broken limbs. Then another, bound to a wooden wheel, was spun until his bones cracked apart, echoing the myth of Ixion. Each story was played with real human lives, history retold through suffering. But the emperor's crowning act was still to come. He rose from his seat, his hand raised, and silence fell across the Colosseum. From beneath the arena, massive gates opened, revealing not beasts but prisoners, men, women, and even children, all chained together in groups. They were herded into the center, trembling, their eyes wide with terror. The emperor decreed that they would fight to the death, not with swords or shields, but with shards of pottery and stones. The chains that bound them together ensured that every struggle was clumsy, every movement agony. The crowd erupted as the condemned, desperate to live, were forced to turn on one another. Mothers screamed as they were dragged into combat. Fathers begged for mercy that never came, and children were caught in the slaughter. The sand of the arena became a pit of chaos, shrieks, blood, and the clang of broken pottery filling the air. Some refused to fight, choosing to stand still even as they were cut down. Others lashed out blindly, driven by terror. The spectacle lasted for hours, each moment designed to stretch the cruelty to its limits. When at last the survivors collapsed, drenched in blood and exhaustion, the emperor gave the final command. Wild beasts were released to finish what remained, tearing apart bodies too broken to resist. The crowd roared louder than ever, enthralled by the horror. This was Rome at its darkest. The Colosseum no longer held games, it held sacrifices. The empire's cruelty had reached its peak, and the cost was not only in lives but in humanity itself. As the sun set, the arena was silent save for the buzz of flies over the carnage. The audience left satisfied, yet something lingered in the air. A heaviness, a sense that Rome had crossed a line even it could not return from. The climax of Roman cruelty had been reached, and from here the empire would never again be the same. The morning after the festival, the sands of the Colosseum were still red. Workers scraped away what they could, shoveling blood-soaked sand into piles, replacing it with fresh earth. To Rome, the games had ended. To the slaves who survived, the horror would never leave them. Whispers spread through the empire. The spectacle had been too much even for hardened Romans. Some said the gods would curse such cruelty. Others insisted the empire had proven its power beyond doubt. But beneath the marble and pageantry, a darker truth was unfolding. Rome was rotting from within. The Colosseum, meant to embody Roman greatness, had instead revealed its decay. Each act of cruelty was meant to terrify slaves into obedience, to remind conquered peoples that resistance was futile. But cruelty breeds not loyalty, only resentment. Across the empire, in Gaul, in Judea, in Africa, stories of Rome's barbarity spread. To those who lived under Roman chains, the arena was no longer a symbol of glory. It was proof that the empire's soul was poisoned. Even Rome's own people began to change. Children raised in the shadow of the Colosseum grew numb to violence, learning to laugh at suffering before they could read or write. Senators who once claimed to govern with wisdom now gambled on how long a man could scream before death. Compassion became weakness, mercy became shame, and cruelty became culture. The games did not strengthen Rome, they hollowed it out. For every life broken in the arena, a piece of the empire's humanity was lost. And though Rome's armies still marched, conquering and enslaving, the moral foundation of the empire was crumbling. The Colosseum stood for centuries, hosting countless spectacles. But in the end, it was not an emperor's brilliance or Rome's philosophy that the people remembered most. It was the cruelty. The slaves fed to beasts, the prisoners burned alive, the endless tide of blood offered up for applause. Historians today look back in awe at Rome's achievements, its roads, its aqueducts, its architecture. But hidden beneath that grandeur is a truth too often erased, that Rome's greatness was built on suffering, and its glory was stained with the blood of the powerless. The Colosseum is still standing. Tourists walk its halls, touch its ancient stones, and imagine the roar of the crowd. Yet few stop to consider the price of its glory. Few remember the slaves whose bodies were broken on its sands, the families torn apart for entertainment, the children who learned to cheer for death. Rome called itself the Eternal Empire. But no empire lasts forever. Power fades, marble crumbles, and history judges. The question that remains is not whether Rome was mighty, but whether it was just. And so as you picture those blood-soaked sands, ask yourself, what truly defines a civilization? Its monuments of stone, or the way it treats the most powerless among its people? Because in the end, Rome's greatest legacy was not its empire but its cruelty, and that is the lesson history will never allow us to forget.